all, what do you make of the fact that tonight they seem to be pointing the finger pretty directly at this admiral and naming him, both at the White House podium and Pete Hegseth in this tweet in his defense, but really saying that he's responsible for this?
Yeah, I think that that is a great indication of an administration who knows that something has gone terribly wrong here. I think that people are finally recognizing, and that's why you see we did that intro with all of these different leaders and lawmakers saying that this is a stone cold war crime. This is so basic to everybody who has served in the military and who has trained on the law of war and the law of armed conflict, that it is a war crime, that it's no surprise that the administration will be trying to shift the blame. I think that the choice to sort of pin this on Admiral Bradley is an interesting one, but not unexpected, because Secretary Hegseth is not somebody who has exactly leadership qualities, right? He's actually largely unqualified to be in that position. And so, of course, his natural instinct would likely be to say, something has gone wrong, let me find somebody to blame this on. Now, that's not to absolve Admiral Bradley of anything. If the facts really have played out the way that it is being reported, he absolutely had a duty not to follow an unlawful order if it was Secretary Hegseth's order.
Yeah, I mean, Batya, this kind of puts the whole unlawful order thing in a different context, because now there's a real question about whether there was an unlawful order and who gave it.
Well, first of all, the story has been massively misreported. So you have actual headlines saying that Hegseth gave the order for the second hit. That wasn't in the initial Washington Post article, which claimed that following, by hearsay, somebody claimed to have heard Hegseth say, we have to kill everybody, therefore the admiral gave the second hit. So I just want to clear that up. I think that's why Hegseth wrote the tweet, is to just correct the record. But what I don't understand is, it is the Secretary of State's right to determine who is a terrorist and who isn't. The Secretary of State answers to the executive branch. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has determined that these boats are carrying terrorists, which makes the attacks on them legal. And the only question is whether that boat was disabled or whether it was destroyed. If it was destroyed, how were there still live people clinging to it? And if it was only disabled, let me just finish the point, then it was still a threat, meaning it was still a legitimate target. So I'm very confused. And by the way, I've spoken to a lot of veterans today who are also very confused by all of this bipartisan outrage. I don't get
Look,
it.
good thing we have a military lawyer
Can I just
at the table.
respond to two things?
Yeah,
First, I would say to your point about who gave this order, what the Washington Post article said. I think that's precisely why we need the Senate and the House to do what they're supposed to do:
I
have
totally
oversight,
agree, by
have
the way.
investigations.
I totally agree.
Let's figure it out.
I want more information as well.
And second, on the point of the Secretary of State making it something a designated terrorist organization, that actually does not enable you to lethally target somebody. Naming somebody on the Secretary of State's list of foreign terrorist organizations actually only does, serious things. You can sanction people who are members of DTOs or FTOs. You can ban them from immigrating to the United States. You can actually criminally prosecute people who give them support, material support to terrorism. But it does not enable you to lethally target them. Yes, many DTOs and FTOs end up being organizations that we target abroad, but that's subject to congressional authorization and the laws of armed conflict when we see them abroad.
So you are in a dispute with the administration about that, which is totally fine.
Precisely.
Yes, okay, so,
Yes.
yes. So, but I am not. I think that they have that authority, so they have not been challenged yet in any significant way, neither by Congress nor by the court. And so obviously, you're siding with
Yeah,
them.
I'll let you get in, but I don't want us to lose the point here. The question is actually not whether or not this was a legitimate target. I think there's dispute about that, but that's not what we're disputing. The question is whether it is legal, according to our rules of engagement and the laws of armed conflict that we abide by, to strike a target a second time when the target doesn't appear to pose a threat or is surrendering. That is the part that I think is in dispute, and that's not a question of whether they were terrorists or not. Even if they were terrorists, that might very well be illegal.
I think we should take a step back, because the only reason we know about this is because obviously somebody involved in that operation was uncomfortable with what was happening.
Yeah.
And that's how the Washington Post found out about it. Somebody leaked this to a reporter. People are not happy with Hegseth's leadership at the department. People are not happy with some of the things that the military is being ordered to do, whether it's the SEAL team, whether it's CENTCOM, whether it's, and I think that we have to pay attention to the fact that this isn't coming from some random reporter who was on the boat with them. This is coming from an internal source who is unhappy with the
And to
leadership
to that
of the
point-
administration.
To that point, the Washington Post had a story tonight that this is a quote from a military official. This is protect Pete bullshit, that source said. One official said of Levitt's statement, it's throwing us, the service members, under the bus.
Right. I think it's going
So
to be hard for this guy to
there
keep
is
his job.
clearly not just whatever happened in that strike, but the cleanup from the White House is causing a lot of consternation.
Yeah, well, one thing I would note is every lawmaker you played started their thought by saying, if this is true. And the fact of the matter is there is a lot in dispute tonight. We don't know the answers to everything. And Batya raised an important point that there is a difference between disabling a boat and destroying it. If it was only disabled under the laws of war, actually, they would have potentially been able to make that a military target. But I think a couple important points to make here more generally is, it's interesting to hear the media talking about this breathlessly for hours and hours when, Biden or Obama drone striked. The only thing that needed to happen was John Kirby would go on TV and say, oh, we made a mistake, we're learning from it. And nobody batted an eye. And yet now this has become the biggest,
It's
story,
actually
though.
not true
This
that
has
no one
become
batted
the
an
biggest
eye
story,
at
though.
Obama's highly controversial drone strikes. That's the first thing.
No, and in fact, in the al-Awlaki strike, which was probably one of his most controversial, the legal opinion supporting that strike was fully disclosed at some point. And I think that's what needs to happen here. We need to see the legal opinions.
But I think the
supporting
bigger story, though,
strikes.
is the average Trump voter looks at this and they think, why is the media breathlessly covering narco-terrorists and drug traffickers when the average American looks at this and thinks, oh, Donald Trump is actually
Well, what I would say to
protecting
the average
border.
Trump voter is that, we have rules of engagement in the world that are not there to protect narco-terrorists. They're there to protect American soldiers in combat. And so it's super important for people who, I'm sure a lot of Trump supporters who have loved ones who are going out in armed conflicts to know that when they are engaged by an enemy, that enemy, if they are not adhering to rules of war, are held responsible for those violations, and that, if they are adhering to rules of war, if they are struck in an attack and then they've survived, there are rules about what happens to them. They don't get just assassinated on the battlefield if they weren't taken out in the initial strike. So that's why it matters. It matters to Trump voters. It matters to Biden voters. It also matters to the United States' credibility in the world, because this isn't just, look, we don't even know who these people were. We don't know what drugs they were carrying. It's not about that. It's about whether or not we operate by any rules at all.
Absolutely, and I think that's the real challenge here, because it's an irony, if not hypocrisy, to see both White House and Congress of both parties all of a sudden full of this moral energy when international law has been stripped and disregarded, human rights have been stripped and disregarded. We could talk about that in regard to Gaza, war crimes, what I consider genocide, but we can debate that, right? But same is true with executors. We just had the Prince of Saudi Arabia treated like a king. You got crimes against humanity taking place every day. Same is true in the history of the United States vis-a-vis Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823, we have intervened in 31 of the 33 countries down there. So you can imagine what they think of us. Military coups against democratic regimes, Guatemala, Goulart, Brazil, we can go on and on and on. So it's an irony to see all of a sudden both of these parties saying, we've got this moral authority concerned about what is a war crime and what isn't. Okay, let's debate that.
Well,
but the larger context is the war crimes have been shot through the history of the
But
country.
Abby, I
Give Margaret a quick moment to
I
respond,
hear
and
you.
then we'll continue.
I will say I think it's encouraging that there is outrage